On a warm July evening in 1961, Christine Keeler stepped out of a swimming pool at Cliveden House, wearing nothing but a smile. Standing at the pool's edge was John Profumo, Secretary of State for War, married, ambitious, and responsible for Britain's nuclear secrets. 3 days earlier, the same girl had shared a bed with Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché and confirmed intelligence operative. But this wasn't a chance encounter. For 30 years, Cliveden had operated as Britain's most exclusive political salon, where cabinet ministers mingled with foreign agents, where policy was whispered between cocktails, and where the rules that governed everyone else simply did not apply. Until they did. Chapter 1. Where American money bought British legitimacy. Before Cliveden became synonymous with scandal, it was a colonial fortune's desperate bid for acceptance by an aristocracy that would never truly let them in. William Waldorf Astor arrived in Britain in 1891, carrying one of the largest fortunes in the Western world. His family had made their money the American way: fur trading, real estate speculation, slum tenements in Manhattan. By the time William inherited the empire, the Astor name meant wealth on a scale that made European aristocrats uncomfortable. $30 million in 1891 money, enough to buy half of London if he wanted to. But he didn't want London. He wanted something money alone couldn't purchase: legitimacy. British society in the 1890s operated by rules that seemed designed specifically to humiliate people like William Astor. You could own a railroad, fund a museum, marry your daughter to a duke. None of it mattered if your grandfather had sold animal pelts for a living. The doors to the most exclusive drawing rooms remained politely but firmly closed. Invitations arrived for charity galas, but never for intimate dinners. You were useful, necessary even, but you would never truly belong. William understood that architecture could communicate what bloodlines could not. In 1893, he purchased Cliveden Estate for £125,000. The house itself was a massive Italianate mansion designed by Charles Barry, the architect behind Parliament, sitting on 376 acres overlooking the Thames. Previous owners included dukes and earls, men whose names appeared in the Domesday Book. By buying Cliveden, William wasn't just acquiring property. He was purchasing a pedigree that stretched back centuries, hoping it might obscure the smell of new money. Then he spent another £400,000 making sure everyone knew about it. He imported entire gardens from Italy, shipping Renaissance fountains and Roman sarcophagi across the Mediterranean. He commissioned formal terraces that required 40 full-time gardeners to maintain. He rebuilt the servants' quarters to house a staff of 70. The estate's water system alone cost more than most English country houses cost to build. Every room featured artwork purchased from European collections at prices that made auction houses gasp. Cliveden became a temple dedicated to the proposition that American money could be transformed into European refinement through sheer force of expenditure. The British aristocracy accepted his hospitality while privately mocking his desperation. They came to his parties, admired his sculptures, and returned to their London townhouses to laugh about the American trying to buy his way into Burke's peerage. William responded by hosting even larger gatherings, inviting even more important people, spending even more extravagantly. The Prince of Wales attended a weekend party in 1894. William catalogued every titled guest in meticulous records, as if a guest book could serve as evidence in a trial determining his social legitimacy. It never quite worked. He received honors, titles eventually, even became a British citizen, and sat in the House of Lords. But he remained fundamentally other, an American playing at being English, a trader's descendant pretending to be gentry. Like Cliveden, for all its grandeur, couldn't erase the original sin of wrong origins. What William didn't realize was that he had built something more useful than acceptance. He had created a space where proximity to power mattered more than birthright, where the ability to gather important people in beautiful surroundings became its own form of influence, where hospitality could be weaponized. His daughter-in-law would understand this better than he ever did. Chapter 2. The hostess who learned power's real language. When Nancy Astor married into Cliveden in 1906, she discovered that political influence in Britain wasn't won through votes, but through weekend invitations. Nancy Langhorne arrived from Virginia with beauty, charm, and absolutely no respect for the British class system that had defeated her father-in-law. She was American in a way that William never quite managed. Unapologetic, direct, comfortable in her own skin. Where William had spent fortunes trying to seem English, Nancy simply decided that being American was more interesting anyway. The aristocracy found this simultaneously appalling and irresistible. She married William's son Waldorf in 1906, becoming mistress of Cliveden at age 27. Within months, she transformed weekend house parties from William's stiff, anxious gatherings into something far more valuable. The place where Britain's political elite came to think out loud. The mechanism was simple, but devastatingly effective. Nancy curated guest lists the way a theater director casts a play. Cabinet ministers, newspaper editors, foreign diplomats, society beauties, writers who could be useful. Never more than 20 people for dinner. Always a mix that generated conversation rather than polite silence. She seated them strategically, making sure the foreign secretary ended up next to the editor of the Times, ensuring the American ambassador could speak privately with the chancellor. The formal dining room became a stage where Britain's ruling class performed for each other without the burden of official record. This mattered because of how British power actually functioned. Parliament was theater, useful for making announcements and maintaining democratic appearances. But real decisions happened elsewhere. In private clubs where membership determined access, at country estates where men spoke freely after the port came out, in drawing rooms where hostesses like Nancy could engineer conversations that shaped policy before bills ever reached the floor. Waldorf entered Parliament in 1910, representing Plymouth. But his real political education happened at Cliveden, watching Nancy work a room like a conductor leading an orchestra. She had discovered that information was currency. A minister's offhand comment about trade policy, shared with the right newspaper editor, could become tomorrow's headline. A diplomat's private worry about German rearmament, whispered to a sympathetic MP, could influence a committee vote. Nancy collected these fragments, remembered them, deployed them strategically. When Waldorf's father died in 1919 and he inherited the viscountcy, it meant leaving the House of Commons for the Lords. Nancy ran for his Plymouth seat and won, becoming Britain's first female member of Parliament to actually take her seat. The newspapers celebrated this as democratic progress. Nancy understood it differently. Parliament gave her a platform. Cliveden gave her power. The weekend parties intensified. Friday evenings, cars would arrive carrying politicians exhausted from the week's battles in Westminster. They came to Cliveden to relax, which meant they came with their guards down. Nancy's genius was understanding that men revealed more over croquet and cocktails than they ever would across a committee table. a cabinet minister, 3 drinks in and comfortable in a leather chair, would discuss upcoming policy decisions with a casualness that would be impossible in Whitehall. Foreign diplomats, charmed by Nancy's attention and the beauty of the gardens, would share their government's actual positions rather than official talking points. By the early 1930s, an invitation to Cliveden carried weight that transcended social prestige. Ministers attended because they needed to know what other ministers were thinking. Editors came because stories broke there before they appeared in official briefings. Diplomats accepted because Cliveden offered access to British decision-makers in an environment where deniability was built into the architecture. Nothing said at Cliveden was ever official. Everything said at Cliveden mattered. Nancy herself became a force in Parliament, particularly on issues of women's rights and temperance. But her real influence operated through a channel that had no name and left no official record. She shaped opinions, connected people who needed to find each other, and provided a space where Britain's elite could speak the quiet parts out loud. Cliveden wasn't just a house where powerful people gathered. It was infrastructure, essential machinery in how Britain's ruling class actually governed. The system worked perfectly as long as everyone invited understood the rules. Discretion was absolute. What happened at Cliveden stayed at Cliveden. Conversations were deniable. Presence implied trust. The guest list was self-selecting. Only people who already belonged to the club received invitations. And the club's primary requirement was understanding that some things were never to be spoken about publicly. This arrangement would work beautifully until the weekend guests started, including people who wanted to destroy Britain rather than govern it. Chapter 3. When the guest list became a national threat. By 1937, the politicians drinking champagne at Cliveden were advocating positions that would soon be classified as treason. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Throughout the early 1930s, Nancy and Waldorf's weekend parties maintained their influence, the guest lists a careful balance of power and wit. But as Hitler consolidated control in Germany and Europe began its slide toward war, the conversations at Cliveden took on a darker character. The question was no longer how to manage the German situation. It became whether managing it meant accommodation. So Nancy Astor had always been suspicious of war. Her American background made her skeptical of European power games. Her Christian Science faith emphasized peace and reconciliation. When guests started arriving who shared these instincts, she listened. When those guests included some of Britain's most powerful men, she provided them a platform. The phrase Cliveden Set was coined in 1937 by Claude Cockburn, a communist journalist writing for a publication called The Week. He used it to describe the pro-appeasement faction he believed was meeting secretly at the estate to coordinate Britain's surrender to fascism. The label was inflammatory, probably exaggerated, and absolutely effective. Within months, Cliveden Set became shorthand for a shadow government supposedly manipulating British policy from a baroque mansion in Buckinghamshire. The reality was more complicated, but not necessarily more comforting. Nancy and Waldorf weren't running a conspiracy. They were simply doing what they had always done, hosting the people who mattered and letting them speak freely. But by 1937, the people who mattered included Lord Halifax, soon to be Foreign Secretary, who believed Hitler could be reasoned with. Neville Chamberlain's closest allies, who saw appeasement as prudent statesmanship rather than cowardice. Geoffrey Dawson, editor of The Times, Britain's most influential newspaper, who used his editorial page to argue for accommodation with Germany. In the guest book from a May 1937 weekend reads like a directory of Britain's appeasement faction. Foreign Office officials who had met with Hitler's representatives, conservative MPs who believed another European war would destroy Britain economically, society figures who found German efficiency and order appealing compared to Britain's messy democracy, and at least one German ambassador, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's representative in London, who attended Cliveden parties and reported back to Berlin that Britain's ruling class had no stomach for confrontation. This was Nancy's old system operating exactly as designed, important people gathering in a beautiful setting to speak without official constraint. But now the unofficial conversations included whether Britain should accept German dominance of Eastern Europe, whether Czechoslovakia was worth fighting for, whether Churchill's warnings about Hitler were the paranoid ravings of a warmonger or the only honest assessment of what was coming. The guest list showed the mechanism of elite decision-making laid bare. These weren't backroom conspirators plotting surrender. They were Britain's leadership, exhausted from one world war and terrified of another, trying to convince each other that accommodation was wisdom rather than capitulation. They spoke at Cliveden because they trusted each other, because Nancy's hospitality created an atmosphere of intimacy, and because saying these things in Parliament would have been political suicide. Dawson's Times ran editorials suggesting that German grievances about Versailles were legitimate. Halifax met with Hitler in November 1937 and came away convinced the Führer was a reasonable man with limited territorial ambitions. Chamberlain pursued his policy of appeasement with the confidence of someone who had discussed it extensively with Britain's best minds, many of them over brandy at Cliveden. When he returned from Munich in September 1938, waving a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time, he was enacting a policy that had been refined through dozens of weekend conversations. Nancy herself never wavered in her conviction that another war would be catastrophic. She was right about that. What she missed was that preventing the war through appeasement would be even more catastrophic. The same system that had made Cliveden influential, the informal networks where elite consensus formed, and had become an echo chamber. Everyone invited thought roughly the same thing. Anyone who disagreed too strongly stopped receiving invitations. Churchill, who had been a Cliveden regular in the 20s, was no longer welcome by the late 30s. His warnings about Germany were considered extremist, his calls for rearmament expensive and dangerous. The Cliveden Set, to the extent it existed as an actual faction, had excluded the one voice that might have forced them to question their assumptions. This is what happens when power concentrates in informal networks accountable to no one but themselves. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain finally declared war, the Cliveden Set's influence collapsed overnight. Appeasement transformed from prudent diplomacy to national humiliation. The weekend parties that had shaped policy for a decade became evidence of how badly Britain's elite had misjudged the threat. Nancy's guest lists, once a source of power, became historical documents proving how ruling class insularity could produce strategic catastrophe. Cliveden's role as political salon survived the war, barely. But the estate's reputation never fully recovered from the accusation that it had been where Britain's leadership convinced itself to surrender without fighting. The House had enabled elite conversation for decades. Now everyone understood that elite conversation, unchecked and unaccountable, could drive a nation toward disaster. The war ended. Nancy and Waldorf aged. A new generation inherited Cliveden, and the estate, always adaptable, found a new purpose. If it could no longer be the place where policy was shaped, it could become something else entirely. the place where power came to play. Chapter 4: The Cottage, where rules stopped applying. On the grounds of Cliveden sat a small cottage that Nancy Astor never visited, where her son turned parties into something the main house could never officially acknowledge. Bill Astor inherited Cliveden in 1952 when his father Waldorf died. Nancy lived on the estate for another 12 years, a formidable presence well into her 80s, but the house was no longer hers to control. Bill was a different creature than his parents, born into wealth so complete it eliminated ambition, educated at Eton and Oxford, married 3 times, interested in politics but not consumed by it. He served in Parliament, managed the family's affairs competently, and discovered that in the 1950s there were more interesting things to do at Cliveden than host cabinet ministers. The estate grounds included Spring Cottage, a small property about 500 yards from the main house, close enough that you could walk over after dinner at Cliveden, far enough away that whatever happened there could be considered separate from whatever happened in the main residence. This physical separation would prove essential to the architecture of plausible deniability. Bill gave Spring Cottage to Stephen Ward. Ward was an osteopath, which in 1950s Britain meant something between physical therapist and society doctor. He treated backs and necks for wealthy clients who appreciated his skill and his discretion. He was also, by all accounts, one of the most socially ambitious men in London. Ward wanted proximity to power, access to wealth, invitations to the right parties. He had charm, intelligence, and a talent for making useful connections. What he didn't have was money or breeding. Bill Astor and Stephen Ward became friends in a way that was typical of British class dynamics in that era. Bill found Ward amusing, interesting, a window into worlds beyond the aristocratic bubble. Ward found Bill useful, a legitimate member of the elite who could provide access and credibility. They discovered a mutual interest in beautiful women and sophisticated parties, which, in the context of the 1950s, meant gatherings that mixed high society with showgirls, artists with debutantes, politicians with prostitutes, all under the guise of bohemian sophistication. The Spring Cottage became the venue for these experiments in social boundary crossing. Ward would host dinners and weekend gatherings that brought together people who would never meet in conventional settings. Cabinet ministers would find themselves drinking with nightclub dancers. Foreign diplomats would chat with 19-year-old models. The appeal was partly sexual, obviously. Young women from working-class backgrounds provided decoration and possibility. But it was also about the thrill of rule-breaking for men whose entire lives operated within rigid social codes. The cottage itself was modest, certainly compared to Cliveden's grandeur. A few bedrooms, a living area, a kitchen. But modesty was part of its function. It signaled informality, a space where the normal rules didn't apply. You couldn't maintain aristocratic pretensions in Spring Cottage the way you could at the main house. That was the point. It was a pressure release valve, a place where men who spent their public lives performing propriety could drop the performance. Bill Astor participated in these gatherings but maintained careful distance. He would attend parties at the cottage, but he never lived there. He socialized with Ward's guests, but his official residence remained Cliveden proper. This separation was strategic. If anything inappropriate happened at Spring Cottage, Bill could claim it was Ward's party, Ward's guests, Ward's responsibility. The cottage was on Cliveden grounds, but it operated under different management. Ward, for his part, understood exactly what he was providing. He curated the guest list at Spring Cottage, the way Nancy Astor had curated Cliveden's weekends, but with different objectives. Nancy had wanted political influence. Ward wanted social elevation, and increasingly, the leverage that came from knowing powerful men's secrets. He introduced titled men to beautiful women, facilitated encounters, and remembered everything. Every conversation, every flirtation, every indiscretion became information that Ward stored away. The women who attended these parties came from Ward's extensive network. He met them through his osteopathy practice, through artist circles, through Soho nightclubs. Some were aspiring models or showgirls hoping to meet wealthy men. Some were simply young women from working-class backgrounds seduced by the glamour of estates and aristocrats. Ward presented these introductions as him doing everyone a favor, giving working-class girls access to worlds they could never otherwise enter, providing bored aristocrats with exciting company. What Ward created at Spring Cottage was a market, supply and demand carefully balanced. The supply was youth, beauty, novelty, and the frisson of class transgression. The demand came from men who had everything except the freedom to acknowledge their appetites publicly. Ward operated as intermediary, the man who made connections without asking awkward questions, the friend who could be trusted to arrange encounters and forget they ever happened. Nancy Astor, still living at Cliveden in a separate wing of the main house, either didn't know about Spring Cottage's activities or chose not to know. She was in her 70s by the late 50s. Her political influence long faded, her health declining. The estate that she had controlled so completely had moved beyond her governance. Her son's parties were not her parties. The people attending Spring Cottage were not the people she would have invited. But Bill owned Cliveden now, and what happened on the grounds was his business. The system worked smoothly for nearly a decade. Spring Cottage hosted its parties. Important men attended. Beautiful women provided entertainment. Stephen Ward gained proximity to power and collected secrets. Bill Astor maintained plausible deniability. Everyone involved understood the rules. Discretion was absolute. Nothing was ever discussed publicly, and the physical separation between cottage and main house meant that Cliveden itself remained technically uninvolved. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely if Ward had restricted his guest list to British aristocrats and working-class girls. But Ward was ambitious. He wanted to meet more important people, have more interesting connections, expand his circle of influence. So when he encountered a Soviet naval attaché who seemed sophisticated and charming, Ward did what he always did. He invited him to a party. Chapter 5. The Showgirl, the Minister, and the Spy. Christine Keeler was 19 years old when Stephen Ward brought her to Cliveden, already sleeping with a Soviet intelligence officer, about to meet the man controlling Britain's nuclear arsenal. Keeler had arrived in London from Wraysbury, a small town near Windsor, at age 16. She worked as a showgirl at Murray's Cabaret Club, in one of those Soho establishments where girls in elaborate costumes stood mostly naked on stage while men in dinner jackets pretended to be interested in the choreography. She was beautiful in a specific way that the early 1960s found irresistible. Dark hair, large eyes, a combination of innocence and availability that men like Stephen Ward collected. Ward met her at Murray's in 1959. She was 17, he was 45. He offered to draw her portrait, a line he used frequently and that apparently worked. Within weeks, she had moved into his flat at Wimpole Mews in central London, an arrangement Ward presented as mentorship and protection. He would help her with modeling work, introduce her to useful people, expand her horizons beyond the narrow world of Soho nightclubs. In exchange, she would attend his parties, be decorative and charming, and understand that sometimes wealthy men at these gatherings would find her interesting. By 1961, Keeler was part of Ward's regular rotation of girls brought to Spring Cottage. She knew the routine. Dress well, smile, be friendly, but not aggressively available. Let the men make the first move, and never discuss what happened afterward. Ward coached her on conversation topics, taught her which men were politicians and which were merely wealthy, explained that discretion was the only real rule. Yevgeny Ivanov entered Ward's circle in early 1961. He was assistant Soviet naval attaché at the Soviet embassy, which meant he was an intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. This was standard practice for both sides during the Cold War. In embassies were spy nests, and everyone in the intelligence community knew it. Ivanov's job was to develop sources, gather information, and report back to Moscow about British defense capabilities and political intentions. Ward met Ivanov through mutual friends in London's social scene. MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence service, was aware of the connection and initially encouraged it. They asked Ward to develop Ivanov as a potential defector, or at least as a channel for communications with Moscow. Ward, flattered by the attention and excited by the spycraft, agreed to cultivate the friendship. This meant inviting Ivanov to parties, introducing him to interesting people, and making him feel welcome in British society. It was monumentally stupid for multiple reasons. Ward had no training in intelligence work, no understanding of operational security, and no ability to maintain appropriate boundaries. Ivanov was a professional intelligence officer who immediately understood that Ward's parties provided access to British elite society in settings where people spoke freely. And MI5's decision to use Ward as an informal asset without properly controlling him showed catastrophic institutional carelessness. By July 1961, Ward had introduced Ivanov to Christine Keeler. They became lovers almost immediately. A 19-year-old showgirl and a 41-year-old Soviet intelligence officer. Keeler later claimed she had no idea Ivanov was a spy, which was probably true in the sense that nobody had explicitly told her his actual job title. But she knew he was Russian, knew he worked at the Soviet embassy, and knew that Ward seemed unusually interested in what Ivanov said during their private moments. On the 8th of July, 1961, Bill Astor hosted a weekend party at Cliveden. The official guest list included John Profumo, Secretary of State for War in Harold Macmillan's conservative government, and his wife, Valerie Hobson, a former film actress. Profumo was 46 years old, ambitious, positioned for higher office, responsible for Britain's military readiness, including nuclear weapons policy and NATO coordination. He was also, by all accounts, easily bored by his marriage and susceptible to beautiful women who paid him attention. Stephen Ward was also at Cliveden that weekend, staying at Spring Cottage as usual. He had brought guests, including Christine Keeler and Yevgeny Ivanov. The separation between official party at the main house and unofficial party at the cottage was standard procedure. But on Saturday evening, the two groups merged. What happened next has been reconstructed through multiple testimonies, official investigations, and Keeler's own accounts. The basic facts are undisputed. Early evening, some guests from the main house walked down to the outdoor swimming pool on the grounds. Profumo was among them. At the same time, Ward brought his party from Spring Cottage to the pool. Keeler decided to swim. At some point, she climbed out of the pool naked, or nearly so. Different accounts vary on whether this was spontaneous exhibitionism or Ward's deliberate staging. What matters is that John Profumo, Britain's Secretary of State for War, saw a 19-year-old girl emerge from a swimming pool wearing nothing, and his interest was immediate and obvious. Ward, recognizing opportunity, introduced them. Profumo was charming. Keeler was flattered by his attention. They spoke briefly, Profumo already calculating how to pursue this further. Ivanov was also present at the pool, also interested in Keeler, creating the precise geometry that would destroy everything. 3 people, 1 swimming pool, 1 July evening. The British minister controlling nuclear secrets, the Soviet intelligence officer tasked with gathering those secrets, and the 19-year-old girl who was sleeping with the Soviet spy and about to sleep with the British minister, creating a security nightmare so obvious it seems designed by someone with a dark sense of humor about the fragility of state secrecy. The timeline is what makes this transcend ordinary adultery into something operationally catastrophic. On July 8th, Keeler was at Cliveden with Ivanov, sharing his bed that night or within days. On July 11th, 3 days later, Profumo arranged a meeting with Keeler in London and began an affair that would continue for months. During this period, Profumo attended cabinet meetings where Britain's nuclear strategy was discussed, read classified intelligence reports about Soviet capabilities, and had access to NATO secrets that Moscow would have paid fortunes to obtain. And he was sleeping with the same girl who was sleeping with a Soviet intelligence officer. The operational security implications were so severe that when MI5 eventually learned about the affair, their first assumption was that it must be a honey trap, a deliberate Soviet operation. But the evidence suggests something worse. It was simply carelessness, powerful men pursuing pleasure without considering consequences, and a system where nobody thought to ask whether the Secretary of State for War should be attending parties with Soviet spies. Profumo and Keeler's affair lasted approximately 6 months. They met at Ward's flat, at Keeler's flat, occasionally at Cliveden when circumstances allowed. Profumo was cautious enough to avoid being photographed with her, but not cautious enough to end the affair or to report it to security services. Keeler later described him as generous and attentive, bringing small gifts, arranging hotel rooms, behaving exactly like a married man conducting a conventional affair. Except nothing about this was conventional. And Keeler was simultaneously involved with Ivanov, though that relationship apparently cooled as Profumo became more possessive. Ward was asking Keeler to extract information from Profumo about nuclear weapons, specifically whether Britain planned to provide warheads to West Germany. Ward claimed this was at MI5's request, part of his informal intelligence role. But MI5 later denied ever asking Ward to use Keeler as an intelligence asset, leaving open the question of whether Ward was freelancing or whether someone in British intelligence had authorized using a showgirl to gather information from their own Secretary of State for War. The affair ended in December 1961. Profumo's wife had grown suspicious. His political advisors warned that he was being reckless. And Keeler's life was becoming complicated in ways that threatened to draw public attention. She had other lovers, other dramas, and by early 1962, the affair with Profumo had simply run its course. But the security breach remained. For 6 months, Britain's war minister had shared a bed with a girl who was sharing a bed with Soviet intelligence. He had pillow talk conversations with someone who was having pillow talk conversations with a Soviet officer. Whether Keeler actually passed information to Ivanov is unknowable. Whether Ivanov asked is certain. Whether Profumo revealed anything classified is likely. Whether this constituted espionage or merely catastrophic judgment failure doesn't really matter. What mattered was that when this eventually became public, it would prove that Britain's security services had allowed a cabinet minister to conduct an affair with a Soviet agent's girlfriend without intervention. That MI5 had known about Ward's connection to Ivanov, had encouraged Ward to develop that connection, and had then failed to prevent Ward from introducing Ivanov to people who had access to state secrets. That the entire system of elite discretion, the unwritten rules about privacy and trust that governed places like Cliveden, had created an environment where national security became secondary to social pleasure. One swimming pool, one warm evening, 3 days between the Soviet spy and the British minister, and nobody with the authority to stop it thought stopping it was more important than maintaining the discretion that allowed powerful men to pursue 19-year-old girls at country estate parties. The machinery was now in motion toward collapse. Chapter 6. When discretion became conspiracy. The affair itself was dangerous, but what came next transformed personal indiscretion into a constitutional crisis, the systematic cover-up. By early 1962, rumors about Profumo and Keeler were circulating in precisely the circles where such rumors always circulated first. Among Ward's friends, within certain Westminster clubs, in newsrooms where journalists traded gossip they couldn't yet publish. These rumors remained contained by the same discretion rules that had always protected powerful men. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the gentleman's agreement that private indiscretions stayed private. But Christine Keeler's life was about to ensure that nothing stayed private. In December 1961, the same month Profumo ended their affair, Keeler became involved with 2 other men, Johnny Edgecombe and Lucky Gordon, both West Indian immigrants, both volatile, both jealous. By October 1962, their rivalry had turned violent. Edgecombe fired shots at Ward's flat where Keeler was staying, trying to force her to come out. The shooting incident made newspapers. Police investigated. Keeler became newsworthy for reasons having nothing to do with Profumo. Journalists digging into Keeler's background discovered she had interesting friends. Stephen Ward, society osteopath, parties at Cliveden, the connections to wealthy men. And when they pushed further, they found whispers about a cabinet minister. Names weren't published yet, but the questions being asked made their way back to Whitehall. MI5 had known about the Profumo-Keeler affair since at least mid-1962. The exact timeline of who knew what when remains disputed, but by summer 1962, Britain's security services were aware that their Secretary of State for War had been sleeping with a girl who was sleeping with a Soviet intelligence officer. Their response revealed everything about how the system prioritized protecting its own over protecting national security. The standard procedure when a cabinet minister becomes a security risk is immediate removal from sensitive positions. At minimum, Profumo should have been quietly moved to a department without access to classified information. But removing Profumo would require explaining why, which would make the affair public, which would create scandal, which would embarrass the government. So instead, MI5 warned Profumo about Ward's Soviet connections and trusted him to be more careful in the future. This was institutional protection, disguised as security procedure. By warning Profumo rather than removing him, MI5 transformed the security breach into a shared secret between the minister and the intelligence services. Now everyone was complicit. Profumo knew that MI5 knew. MI5 knew that Profumo knew they knew. And both sides had incentive to maintain silence because exposure would damage both the minister and the service that had failed to prevent his catastrophic judgment. Through late 1962 and early 1963, the machinery of elite protection activated at every level. Newspaper editors who had pieces of the story were visited by government officials and asked to hold publication in the national interest. Lawyers representing potential witnesses contacted other potential witnesses to coordinate stories. Ward himself was warned by police to be careful about his associations, a message that was simultaneously threat and encouragement to stay quiet. But the story had too many unstable elements. Christine Keeler couldn't be controlled the way powerful men could. She was young, broke, angry at how she had been used, and increasingly willing to talk to journalists who paid for information. Ward was growing paranoid and sensing that he was being positioned as a scapegoat for behavior that had been enabled by the very people now distancing themselves from him. And the press had enough fragments of the truth that filling in the remaining blanks was only a matter of time. In March 1963, the situation reached critical mass. Rumors about Profumo had become so widespread that multiple MPs were preparing to raise questions in Parliament. Newspapers had stories ready to publish. The government could no longer contain this through quiet pressure and gentlemen's agreements. On March 21, 1963, Labour MP George WWII stood up in the House of Commons and, under the protection of parliamentary privilege, and asked whether the government was aware of rumors about a minister's relationship with Christine Keeler and her connections to a Soviet intelligence officer. WWII didn't name Profumo explicitly, but everyone in Westminster knew exactly who he meant. Profumo now faced the choice that would define the scandal's ultimate scope. He could admit the affair, resign quietly, and accept personal disgrace. Or he could lie to Parliament, gambling that the evidence could still be contained, that discretion would hold, that the system would protect him one more time. He chose to lie. On March 22, 1963, John Profumo stood before the House of Commons and delivered a personal statement. He denied impropriety with Keeler. He acknowledged knowing her casually through Stephen Ward. He threatened legal action against anyone who repeated these allegations outside Parliament's privilege. And he sat down, betting his career and the government's credibility on the proposition that a cabinet minister's word would be accepted without further investigation. This was the critical mistake, the point where personal indiscretion became constitutional crisis. By lying to Parliament, Profumo committed an offense that transcended adultery. Parliamentary privilege exists on the assumption that MPs can speak freely because they are speaking truthfully. When a minister lies directly to Parliament, they corrupt the institution itself. The affair might have been forgiven as human weakness. The lie to Parliament would be unforgivable as institutional betrayal. And Harold Macmillan's government accepted Profumo's statement without serious investigation. The Prime Minister either believed his minister or decided that believing him was more convenient than confirming the truth. This decision revealed how thoroughly the system prioritized self-preservation. Investigating Profumo's statement would require interviewing Keeler, examining evidence, making the affair public. Accepting his denial allowed the government to claim the matter was closed and hope the press would move on. But hope is not a security strategy. Through April and May of 1963, more details leaked. Journalists published increasingly specific accounts of Profumo's affair. Keeler sold her story to the news of the world, providing details that made Profumo's denial impossible to maintain. The evidence became overwhelming that a cabinet minister had lied to Parliament, had committed perjury, had placed the government in the position of defending a lie. By late May, Profumo's allies were quietly advising him that the situation was unsustainable, The evidence was too solid. Keeler's testimony was too detailed. Continuing to deny the affair would only deepen the crisis. The system could protect him from scandal, but it couldn't protect him from perjury once the proof became public. The machinery that had shielded elite indiscretion for decades had finally encountered a truth too documented to suppress. The discretion that allowed cabinet ministers to attend parties with Soviet spies, that permitted society osteopaths to introduce showgirls to war ministers, that enabled every level of the security apparatus to look away rather than confront uncomfortable facts, had created a situation where the evidence of institutional failure could no longer be contained. What had begun as one man's reckless affair had become a test of whether Britain's governing class could lie to Parliament and expect to be believed. The answer, it turned out, was no. But only because Christine Keeler, the person with the least power in the entire scandal, refused to disappear the way powerful men needed her to. Chapter 7. The Lie That Couldn't Hold. On June 5, 1963, John Profumo stood before Parliament and admitted he had lied, destroying not just his career, but the government's credibility. The resignation statement was brief. Profumo acknowledged that his earlier denial had been false. He confirmed the affair with Christine Keeler. He apologized to the House, to his colleagues, to the Prime Minister. He resigned from his position as Secretary of State for War, resigned his seat in Parliament, and withdrew from public life entirely. The statement took less than 2 minutes to read. The damage would last decades. The immediate reaction was shock not at the affair itself, but at the admission of the lie. Westminster had accommodated ministerial indiscretions for centuries. Discreet affairs were considered private matters, unsuitable for public discussion. But lying to Parliament was different. Parliament functioned on the principle that members, especially ministers, spoke truthfully even when the truth was uncomfortable. By lying directly to the House, Profumo had broken something more fundamental than marriage vows. And he had corrupted the institution's basic operating assumption. The newspapers that had been forced to hold the story for months now published everything. The full details of the affair emerged. The swimming pool encounter at Cliveden, the months of meetings at Ward's flat, the simultaneous relationship with Soviet naval attaché Ivanov, the security implications that WWII had known about and failed to act upon. Each revelation made the government's earlier acceptance of Profumo's denial look more like willful blindness. Harold Macmillan's government entered immediate crisis. The Prime Minister had either been lied to by his war minister or had known about the lie and accepted it. Both options were catastrophic. If Macmillan had been deceived, it suggested he had no control over his cabinet. If he had known the truth, it suggested he had participated in misleading Parliament. Either way, the government had placed protecting a minister's reputation above national security. The security implications became public through detailed reporting. For 6 months in 1961 and 62, Britain's Secretary of State for War had been sharing a bed with a girl who was sharing a bed with a Soviet intelligence officer. During this period, Profumo had access to classified information about NATO nuclear strategy, British defense capabilities, and coordination with American forces. Whether Keeler had passed information to Ivanov through Ward was unknowable, but the vulnerability was undeniable. A Soviet intelligence operation couldn't have designed a better penetration scenario if they had tried, and WWII had known. These security services had been aware of Ward's connection to Ivanov since at least early 1962. They had known about the affair between Profumo and Keeler. They had warned Profumo to be careful, but had not removed him from his position. This meant Britain's own intelligence service had determined that protecting a minister's career was more important than eliminating a security risk. The institutional failure cascaded across multiple systems. MI5 had failed to protect state secrets. The Prime Minister's office had failed to investigate suspicious denials. Parliament had accepted a minister's word without demanding evidence. The entire structure of informal discretion that governed British elite society had prioritized protecting privilege over acknowledging reality. What made this particularly explosive in 1963 was the Cold War context. Britain was engaged in an existential struggle against Soviet expansion. Nuclear weapons had made the stakes absolute. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred just 8 months earlier, bringing the world to the edge of annihilation. In this environment, the revelation that a cabinet minister responsible for nuclear strategy had been compromised through a sex scandal was not just embarrassing, it was terrifying. The opposition Labour Party seized on the scandal as proof that the Conservative government was fundamentally unfit to govern. If Macmillan's cabinet couldn't manage their own ministers' affairs, how could they be trusted with national security? If elite discretion meant allowing Soviet spies access to parties with war ministers, wasn't it time to dismantle the entire system of gentlemen's agreements and unwritten rules? Public reaction showed a different kind of shock. The British public in 1963 still largely deferred to establishment authority. The idea that cabinet ministers and intelligence services knew what they were doing remained relatively intact. The Profumo Affair shattered this deference by making elite dysfunction impossible to ignore. When ordinary citizens read about the Secretary of State for War meeting a showgirl at a swimming pool and beginning an affair while Soviet intelligence watched, the image of competent leadership dissolved. The scandal also exposed the massive class divide that had always existed, but rarely became so visible. Christine Keeler was 19, working class, and used by powerful men, and then blamed when the system she had no power within collapsed around her. Profumo was wealthy, educated, protected by every institutional advantage until the moment the lie became unsustainable. The public could see clearly who would pay the real price for this scandal, and who would be protected even in disgrace. Through June and July of 1963, the revelations continued. More details about spring cottage parties emerged. More names of prominent men who had attended Ward's gatherings surfaced, though most were never officially confirmed. The sense grew that Profumo's affair was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of systematic rot, that Cliveden represented something larger about how Britain's elite actually operated when they thought no one was watching. Macmillan's health, already fragile, it deteriorated under the pressure. The Prime Minister, who had survived the Suez Crisis and navigated decolonization, found himself destroyed by a sex scandal. Not because of the sex itself, but because the scandal proved that his government's claims about competence and responsibility were theatrical rather than real. The government tried to contain the damage by initiating investigations. Lord Denning was appointed to conduct an inquiry into the security implications. But investigations only created more opportunities for damaging revelations. Every witness questioned, every document reviewed, every timeline reconstructed reinforced the central truth. The system had failed at every level because the system was designed to protect itself rather than function properly. By August, it was clear that Macmillan's government would not survive the scandal. The question was no longer whether consequences would follow, but how extensive those consequences would be. Profumo himself had withdrawn completely from public life, the first casualty of the collapse. But the machinery that had enabled his behavior was still intact, still operating, still protecting the people who had known and done nothing. That machinery needed a sacrifice larger than one disgraced minister. It needed someone who had enabled everything but couldn't claim the protection of official position. It needed Stephen Ward. Chapter 8. The Scapegoat Who Knew Too Much. Stephen Ward went on trial for living off immoral earnings. But everyone understood he was really being prosecuted for exposing how the system actually worked. The charges against Ward were technically about prostitution. Under British law, living off the earnings of prostitution was a crime, even if the prostitution itself remained legal. The prosecution's theory was that Ward had arranged for women like Christine Keeler to sleep with wealthy men and had benefited financially from these arrangements. The evidence was thin, mostly consisting of testimony from the women themselves about paying Ward rent, while also conducting affairs with men he had introduced them to. But the trial was never really about prostitution law. It was a ritual sacrifice, the establishment's attempt to contain the Profumo scandal by destroying the man who had made it all possible. Ward had committed the unforgivable sin. He had exposed the gap between how Britain's elite claimed to operate and how they actually operated. For that, he needed to be punished in a way that demonstrated the system could still enforce consequences, even if those consequences fell on the least powerful person involved. The trial began on July 22, 1963, at the Old Bailey. Ward faced 5 charges related to living off immoral earnings, and 1 charge of procuring women for prostitution. The prosecution called witnesses, including Christine Keeler, who testified that Ward had encouraged her to sleep with wealthy men and had benefited from the money those men gave her. Other women provided similar testimony, describing how Ward had introduced them to society figures and had shared flats with them while they conducted affairs. Ward's defense was that he had been a friend to these women, providing housing and social connections without financial expectation. He argued that any money the women paid him was legitimate rent, not earnings from prostitution. He pointed out that many of the relationships in question were affairs rather than commercial transactions, and that he had introduced people to each other socially without arranging for payment. The defense was technically accurate but strategically doomed. The trial was happening in the shadow of the Profumo scandal, with newspapers publishing daily coverage that reminded everyone of Ward's role in the affair. The prosecution didn't need to prove that Ward was a traditional pimp. They only needed to prove that he had facilitated sexual encounters and had benefited in some way. And in the atmosphere of 1963 London, that proof was easy to construct from ambiguous evidence. What made the trial particularly cruel was the sudden abandonment by everyone who had used Ward's services. The wealthy men who had attended his parties, the society figures who had appreciated his introductions, the politicians who had enjoyed his hospitality, all disappeared. None came forward to testify on Ward's behalf. None acknowledged that the parties at Spring Cottage had been mutual arrangements where everyone involved had sought pleasure and connection. Ward was left alone to defend behavior that the entire elite class had participated in and benefited from. The prosecution's case revealed exactly how Ward had operated, which meant revealing how elite sexual commerce actually functioned. Ward would meet young women through his osteopathy practice, through art circles, through Soho nightclubs. He would offer them access to a more glamorous world, parties at country estates, introductions to titled men, the possibility of romance, or at least financial security. The women accepted because Ward offered opportunity in a society that provided few legitimate paths for working-class girls to improve their circumstances. Ward would then introduce these women to wealthy men who wanted beauty, youth, and the thrill of crossing class boundaries without consequence. The men accepted because Ward provided access to women they could never meet through conventional social channels, with the added benefit of discretion and deniability. Ward facilitated encounters, smoothed over awkwardness, and ensured everyone involved understood the unwritten rules. His payment came in multiple forms, sometimes direct. Women who lived in his flats paid rent. Sometimes indirect. Wealthy men who appreciated Ward's services would hire him as an osteopath, refer clients, provide social access. Sometimes abstract. The pleasure of proximity to power, invitations to exclusive events, the sense of being essential to elite society. This was not prostitution in any simple sense. It was a complex economy of favors, access, and mutual benefit that operated entirely within unwritten rules. The trial forced all of this into public record. Testimony detailed who had attended Ward's parties, what had happened there, how money and sex and social advantage had circulated through these networks. The establishment's response was to claim shock and horror, to treat Ward's behavior as aberrant rather than systemic, to prosecute him as a criminal rather than acknowledge he had been a service provider for a demand that powerful men had always generated. Ward understood what was happening. In letters and statements during the trial, he made clear that he was being sacrificed to protect others. He noted the hypocrisy of prosecuting him, while the men who had used his services faced no consequences. He pointed out that if he had truly been operating a prostitution ring, then dozens of prominent men should be facing charges as clients. But no clients were charged, only Ward, the intermediary who had made elite sexual access possible. The most damaging evidence against Ward came from the women themselves. Keeler, Mandy Rice Davies, and others testified about Ward's role in their lives. Some testimony was clearly coerced, influenced by police pressure and promises of leniency in their own legal troubles. Some reflected genuine anger at how Ward had used them. But all of it reinforced the prosecution's narrative that Ward had exploited young women for his own benefit. What got lost in this narrative was the women's own agency and the limited choices available to them. Keeler was 19 when she met Ward, working as a showgirl, earning barely enough to survive in London. Ward offered her housing, social connections, and access to men who could change her life circumstances. Was this exploitation or opportunity? The answer depended on whether you believed working-class women had real alternatives for social advancement in 1960s Britain. The trial also revealed how much Ward knew about elite behavior. His testimony and statements included details about which politicians had attended parties, which affairs had occurred at Spring Cottage, which powerful men had compromised themselves through their pursuit of young women. Ward had been present for countless indiscretions, had facilitated dozens of encounters, had witnessed the gap between public morality and private behavior for years. This made him dangerous. A scapegoat is only useful if they accept their role quietly. But Ward was threatening to take others down with him, to expose not just his own behavior, but the entire network that had enabled and benefited from it. The establishment needed him silenced, either through conviction or through some other means of ensuring his knowledge died with his reputation. As the trial progressed through late July, Ward's mental state deteriorated. He was abandoned by friends, publicly humiliated, facing certain conviction and imprisonment. On July 30th, 1963, the day before the trial's conclusion, Ward wrote several letters to friends. Then he took an overdose of sleeping pills. He was found unconscious on July 31st and taken to hospital. The trial concluded without him. On August 3rd, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 2 of the charges. Ward never regained consciousness. He died on August 3rd, 1963, aged 50. The official verdict was suicide. Ward had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of conviction, but the timing raised questions that have never been fully answered. Did Ward kill himself because he saw no other option? Or did someone encourage him to understand that dead men face no further prosecution and cause no further embarrassment? What is certain is that Ward's death was convenient for everyone involved. It ended the trial before his testimony could implicate others. It eliminated the possibility of him writing memoirs or giving interviews about what he knew. It allowed the establishment to close the book on the scandal by pointing to Ward's conviction as proof that justice had been served, while avoiding any deeper investigation into who had enabled his behavior for years. Stephen Ward died having served his purpose as scapegoat. The system that had used him, benefited from him, and enabled him for a decade had successfully transferred all blame onto him while protecting everyone else who had participated in the same behavior. This is how elite systems maintain themselves, by sacrificing the intermediaries who make the system function while preserving the principals who profit from it. But Chapter 9, the government that fell. Because it could no longer be trusted. The Profumo Affair didn't just destroy one minister's career, it shattered the deference that had allowed Britain's elite to govern without genuine accountability. Harold Macmillan's government never recovered from the scandal. The immediate damage was obvious. A cabinet minister had lied to Parliament. Security services had failed to prevent a war minister from compromising national secrets. The Prime Minister had accepted transparent denials without investigation. But the deeper damage was to the social contract between Britain's ruling class and everyone else. That contract had always depended on trust, on the belief that the elite were fundamentally competent and responsible, even if they were occasionally privileged and remote. The Profumo Affair destroyed that trust by making elite dysfunction too visible to ignore. The Lord Denning report, published in September 1963, was supposed to contain the scandal through official investigation. Lord Denning interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence, and produced a comprehensive account of what had happened. The report confirmed the essential facts. Profumo had conducted an affair with Keeler while she was involved with Ivanov. I-5 had known and failed to act decisively. Security had been compromised through carelessness rather than malice. But the report also revealed dozens of additional problems, and other ministers had attended Ward's parties. Other security risks existed that had not been addressed. The report documented a culture where discretion meant looking away from behavior that should have triggered security reviews. Every detail reinforced the sense that the Profumo case was not an isolated failure, but a symptom of systematic institutional rot. Public opinion collapsed. Polls showed catastrophic loss of confidence in Macmillan's government. Trust in the Conservative Party's competence evaporated. The scandal had exposed something the British public had suspected, but could previously ignore. The elite class that governed them operated by different rules, prioritized protecting their own over serving the nation, and considered accountability something that applied to other people. The scandal also accelerated cultural changes already underway. Britain in the early 1960s was beginning to question traditional hierarchies. The deference that had characterized the 1950s was giving way to skepticism about authority. Working-class voices were gaining legitimacy through music, literature, and media. The Profumo Affair landed in this moment of transition and became a catalyst, proof that the old systems of gentlemen's agreements and unwritten rules were no longer sustainable. Within the Conservative Party, the scandal created civil war. Younger MPs argued that Macmillan had to go, that the party needed new leadership to have any chance in the next election. Traditional figures defended Macmillan, but struggled to explain how the scandal had happened under his watch. The party that had governed Britain for over a decade suddenly looked incompetent, out of touch, and morally compromised. Macmillan himself became a tragic figure. He had survived World War I, served with distinction in World War II, navigated decolonization and the Cold War. But a sex scandal involving a showgirl and a swimming pool destroyed him. He aged visibly through the summer of 1963, the strain of the scandal compounding his existing health problems. By October, he was ready to resign. The official reason was prostate issues requiring surgery. The real reason was the Profumo Affair had made his position untenable. Macmillan resigned on October 18, 1963, ending 13 years as a member of Parliament and 7 years as Prime Minister. His resignation speech avoided mentioning Profumo directly, but everyone understood the scandal had been the fatal blow. The Conservative Party chose Alec Douglas Home to replace Macmillan, a decision that showed how disconnected the leadership remained from public sentiment. Douglas Home was an aristocrat, educated at Eton and Oxford, a member of the House of Lords who had to disclaim his peerage to serve as Prime Minister in the Commons. He represented exactly the elite class that the Profumo scandal had discredited. His selection suggested the Conservatives had learned nothing from the scandal about why the public no longer trusted them. The Labour Party under Harold Wilson exploited this brilliantly. Wilson presented himself as a modern, meritocratic alternative to aristocratic privilege. He emphasized his grammar school education, his economics background, his distance from the country estate culture that had produced the Profumo scandal. Labour's campaign message was simple. The old elite had proven they were unfit to govern. Time for someone competent to take over. The general election was called for October 15, 1964. The campaign was dominated by lingering effects of the scandal. Every Conservative policy proposal was met with questions about competence and trustworthiness. How could voters trust a party that had allowed the Profumo situation to develop and then had lied about it? How could national security be left in the hands of people who had treated it as secondary to protecting a minister's reputation? Labour won the election with a narrow majority, gaining 317 seats to the Conservatives' 304. It was not a landslide, but it ended 13 consecutive years of Conservative government. Analysis showed the Profumo scandal had been decisive in key constituencies. Voters who might have supported the Conservatives on economic grounds couldn't bring themselves to vote for a party associated with the scandal. The election result proved that there were still consequences for elite failure, but only when that failure became too public to ignore. The Profumo Affair had crossed the threshold where discretion could no longer protect power. The press had published too many details. The investigations had revealed too much dysfunction. The public had seen clearly how the system actually worked, and they had decided it didn't work well enough to deserve continued authority. But the victory was limited. Labor's narrow majority meant they would struggle to implement major reforms. The civil service, the intelligence agencies, the informal networks of elite power remained largely intact. The scandal had changed who occupied ministerial offices, but had not fundamentally restructured how power operated in Britain. The deeper question was whether anything had actually changed, or whether the scandal was just temporary embarrassment that the system would absorb and move past. The elite networks that had enabled the Profumo Affair still existed. The culture of discretion and mutual protection still operated. The class divisions that had allowed powerful men to exploit working-class women without consequence still structured British society. Cliveden itself remained. The physical infrastructure that had facilitated decades of elite socializing and the specific weekend that had initiated the scandal. The estate was no longer the political salon it had been under Nancy Astor, but its role in British elite culture was not finished. It would simply transform again, adapting to new circumstances the way powerful institutions always do. The Profumo Affair had proven that elite impunity had limits, but it had not proven that those limits could prevent the next scandal, the next failure, the next moment when power would prioritize protecting itself over serving the public interest. That machinery was still intact, waiting for the next opportunity to operate according to its original design. Chapter 10. The estate that survived by ceasing to be itself. After the scandal, Bill Astor could no longer afford to maintain Cliveden as a private residence, and the National Trust took control in 1966. The financial reality was brutal and immediate. Cliveden required an enormous staff to maintain: gardeners for the 376 acres, servants for the main house, specialists for the art collection and antiques. The annual operating cost in the mid-1960s was estimated at £70,000, equivalent to over £1 million today. Bill Astor had inherited wealth, but not infinite wealth, and the scandal had destroyed any possibility of using Cliveden as he had before. The estate that had functioned as a political salon could no longer host political gatherings. No minister would accept an invitation to Cliveden after the scandal. No diplomat would want to be photographed there. The entire value proposition that Nancy Astor had developed, using the estate to create proximity between power and wealth, had collapsed. Cliveden was now associated with dysfunction and disgrace rather than influence and sophistication. Bill considered his options. He could try to maintain Cliveden through private income, bleeding money annually to preserve family heritage. He could sell the estate entirely, accepting that the Astor connection to this particular property was finished. Or he could find a structure that would preserve Cliveden while transferring the financial burden to someone else. The National Trust offered that structure. Founded in 1895, the trust preserved properties of historical or architectural significance by taking ownership and opening them to public access. By the 1960s, the trust controlled hundreds of estates across Britain, funded through admission fees, memberships, and donations. They approached Bill Astor about Cliveden in 1965, seeing the estate as exactly the kind of significant property their mission was designed to protect. The arrangement negotiated was typical of National Trust transfers. Bill Astor donated Cliveden to the trust, receiving tax benefits and ending his obligation to maintain the property. The trust took over ownership, operations, and financial responsibility. Bill retained the right to live in the private wing of the house during his lifetime, a common compromise that allowed former owners to maintain connection to ancestral estates, while acknowledging they could no longer afford full control. In December 1966, the National Trust formally took ownership of Cliveden. The estate that had been private property since the 1660s became a public heritage site. Tours began in 1967 at 5 shillings per person. Visitors walking through the same rooms where Nancy Astor had hosted cabinet ministers and where the July 1961 weekend had occurred that initiated the scandal. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Cliveden had been a seat of power, a place where policy was discussed and influence exercised. Now it was a museum, preserved under glass, in its function reduced to educating tourists about architectural history and aristocratic life. The rooms were maintained exactly as they had been, the furnishings preserved, the gardens carefully tended. But the life had drained from the estate. It was beautiful and empty, a corpse preserved through embalming rather than a living organism. Bill Astor himself withdrew from public life. He had never been prosecuted or formally implicated in the scandal, but his ownership of Cliveden and his friendship with Stephen Ward had made him a figure of public speculation. He lived quietly in the private wing until his death in 1966, just months after the National Trust took control. He was only 58 years old. Official cause of death was heart attack, but the stress of the scandal and its aftermath had clearly taken its toll. The Astor family's connection to Cliveden continued through Bill's son, but the days of the estate as family seat were finished. Subsequent generations had neither the resources nor the desire to reclaim full ownership. Cliveden remained National Trust property, its status as heritage site permanent. The National Trust faced an interesting challenge in how to present Cliveden to the public. The estate had architectural and historical significance independent of the scandal. Charles Barry's design was important. The gardens were exceptional examples of formal Italian style. The art collection was valuable. But everyone visiting Cliveden in the late 1960s wanted to see where the Profumo scandal had happened. The Trust initially downplayed the scandal, focusing tours on architectural features and earlier historical periods. But visitor interest in scandal eventually forced acknowledgement. Guides began mentioning the 1961 weekend, the swimming pool, the cottage where Ward had stayed. The scandal became part of Cliveden's identity, something the Trust couldn't ignore, even if they wanted to emphasize other aspects of the estate's history. This created an ironic situation where Cliveden's greatest scandal became its primary tourist attraction. The thing that had destroyed the estate's function as private residence became the thing that ensured its survival as public property. People paid admission specifically to see where a government had been brought down by a sex scandal. Without the notoriety, Cliveden would have been just another grand house among hundreds in the National Trust's portfolio. The scandal made it special. The financial model worked. Admission fees, National Trust memberships, and eventually events and filming revenues provided sustainable funding. Cliveden became self-supporting in a way it never could have been as private residence. The scandal that had made private ownership impossible had also created public interest that made institutional ownership viable. Spring Cottage, where Stephen Ward had hosted his parties, was demolished in the early 1970s. The National Trust decided the cottage served no historical preservation purpose, and removing it would prevent morbid tourism focused on the scandal's specific location. The swimming pool remained, but the cottage where Ward had lived and where much of the Profumo Affair's architecture had been centered disappeared from the landscape. This erasure was strategic. The National Trust wanted to preserve Cliveden as an architectural and cultural landmark, not as a scandal pilgrimage site. By removing the cottage, they removed the most specific physical reminder of Ward's activities. Visitors could still see the swimming pool and the main house, but the intermediary space where the actual parties had occurred was gone. Cliveden survived the scandal by transforming completely. It ceased to be a private estate where power congregated and became a public museum where tourists learned about history. The transformation was economically necessary and culturally inevitable, but it represented something larger about how institutions survive scandal. By acknowledging their past while fundamentally changing their function, becoming monuments to what they once were, rather than continuing to be what had caused the problem. Chapter 11, Where the Scandal Went While Britain Moved On. Profumo spent the rest of his life working at a charity in London's East End, a redemption arc the other players never achieved. John Profumo's response to disgrace was unexpected, and by all accounts, genuine. After resigning from Parliament in June 1963, he could have disappeared into wealthy obscurity, living off family money and social connections. Instead, he began volunteering at Toynbee Hall, a charity in one of London's poorest neighborhoods, helping with education programs and social services. It started quietly, a few hours per week, Profumo showing up to do manual labor and administrative work. No press announcements, no rehabilitation tour, just consistent presence doing unglamorous tasks. He cleaned toilets, served meals, organized fundraisers, did whatever was needed. Over months and years, this volunteer work became the center of his life. By the 1970s, Profumo was working essentially full-time at Toynbee Hall, having devoted more time to charity than he ever had to politics. British society eventually forgave him. Not immediately, not universally, but gradually. The consistent charity work, the refusal to cash in on notoriety through memoirs or interviews, the apparent genuineness of his remorse created space for redemption. By the 1980s, Profumo could attend public events without causing scandal. He was even awarded a CBE in 1975 for his charitable services, a quiet signal that official Britain had accepted his rehabilitation. He remained married to Valerie Hobson throughout, a detail that British culture found particularly redemptive. His wife had stayed with him through maximum disgrace, and he had spent decades trying to earn that loyalty. When Profumo died in 2006 at age 91, obituaries focused as much on his 43 years of charity work as on the scandal that had defined his public life. Christine Keeler's trajectory was opposite in almost every way. After the scandal, she was pursued relentlessly by tabloids offering money for increasingly sensational stories. She cooperated because she needed income, but each interview reinforced her public image as the showgirl who had brought down a government. She tried to move on, married twice, had children, but the scandal followed her everywhere. The money she made from selling her story disappeared quickly, leaving her in poverty for much of her later life. She struggled with addiction, was convicted on perjury charges in a separate case, and spent decades trying to escape the notoriety that had defined her at 19. Multiple attempts at memoirs and interviews never produced the financial security or public rehabilitation that Profumo achieved. Keeler gave her final major interview in 2013, 50 years after the scandal. She was 71 years old, still living modestly, still remembered primarily for events that had happened when she was a teenager. She died in 2017 at age 75, her obituaries still leading with Profumo rather than anything she had accomplished in the subsequent 54 years. The contrast reveals everything about how scandal's consequences distribute according to power's original allocation. Profumo had wealth, connections, education, and gender privilege that provided a path to redemption. He could retreat to charity work because he didn't need income. He could rebuild his reputation because society was predisposed to forgive powerful men who showed contrition. Keeler had none of these advantages. She had been used by powerful men, blamed when the system collapsed, and then exploited by media that profited from her notoriety while offering nothing sustainable in return. Yevgeny Ivanov returned to Moscow after the scandal, his intelligence career enhanced rather than damaged by the affair. Soviet intelligence viewed the Profumo scandal as an operational success, even if they hadn't specifically planned it. Ivanov had successfully penetrated British elite society, had been present at parties with cabinet ministers, and had been involved in circumstances that damaged British government credibility. Whether he actually gathered useful intelligence mattered less than the chaos he had helped create. He was promoted, decorated, and eventually retired with honors. In interviews decades later, he maintained that his relationship with Keeler was romantic rather than operational, that he had genuinely cared for her and had not used her to gather intelligence. This claim is impossible to verify, but it hardly matters. The operational value of the affair came from its exposure, not from whatever secrets may or may not have been passed during pillow talk. Ivanov died in 1994. Ani remembered in Russia as a successful intelligence officer, and in Britain as the Soviet spy at the center of the Profumo scandal. His reputation in both countries benefited from the affair in ways that none of the British participants' reputations did. Spring Cottage, the physical location where so much of the scandal had unfolded, was demolished in the early 1970s. The National Trust decided that preserving Ward's cottage would turn Cliveden into a scandal tourism site rather than a heritage property. By removing the building, they removed the most tangible reminder of what had happened there. The swimming pool remained as part of the estate's landscape, but the cottage where Ward had lived and hosted his parties disappeared entirely. Bill Astor, who had owned Cliveden and had been friends with Ward and lived only 3 more years after transferring the estate to the National Trust. He died in 1966 at 58, a relatively young death that friends attributed to the stress of the scandal and its aftermath. He was never charged with any crime, but his association with Ward and his ownership of the property where the scandal occurred had destroyed his social position and made continuing to live at Cliveden impossible. Nancy Astor, the grande dame who had made Cliveden into a political salon, lived long enough to see the scandal unfold and the estate transferred to the National Trust. She died in 1964 at 84 years old, having watched her life's work, the careful cultivation of Cliveden as a center of power, destroyed by her son's inability to maintain the discretion that had been the system's only protection. The divergent fates of everyone involved proved that scandal punishes according to existing power structures. Profumo could be rehabilitated because he had resources and social position. Keeler could not because she had neither. Ivanov benefited because his government valued the chaos more than the British government valued secrecy. Ward died because he was useful as a scapegoat and dangerous as a witness. And Cliveden survived by transforming into something completely different, proving that institutions outlast individuals by changing what they are. Chapter 12. The truth that privilege always buys itself time. Today, Cliveden operates as a luxury hotel where guests pay £800 per night to sleep in the rooms where a government fell. The National Trust's solution to Cliveden's expensive maintenance proved temporary. By the late 1970s, even with admission fees and public funding, the estate's operational costs exceeded sustainable levels. The trust needed a revenue model that could fully support the property while preserving its historical character. In 1984, they found it, leased the main house to a luxury hotel operator while retaining ownership and control over the grounds. The hotel arrangement transformed Cliveden again. Rooms that had hosted cabinet ministers in the 1930s and had been toured by middle-class visitors in the 1970s became suites for global wealthy travelers paying premium rates for heritage luxury. The estate's scandal history became marketing material, not embarrassment. Hotel promotional materials reference the Profumo Affair as part of Cliveden's glamorous and slightly dangerous past, selling scandal as sophistication. The swimming pool where Christine Keeler had emerged in July 1961 now serves hotel guests. It was renovated, updated with modern filtration and heating, but remains in the same location where the encounter occurred. Guests swimming in that pool are literally retracing the scandal's origin point, though most probably don't think about it explicitly. The pool is beautiful, the grounds are immaculate, and the history is sanitized into aesthetic backdrop. Room rates at Cliveden range from £800 to £3,000 per night, depending on suite size and season. These prices position the hotel among Britain's most expensive, accessible only to international wealth or special occasion domestic luxury. The estate that William Waldorf Astor purchased to buy legitimacy, that Nancy Astor used to exercise political influence, and that hosted the scandal that destroyed a government, now serves essentially the same function it always has, providing exclusive space where the wealthy can congregate away from ordinary scrutiny. The clientele has changed. Instead of British cabinet ministers and European aristocrats, Cliveden now hosts global executives, foreign investors, and wealthy tourists seeking authentic British heritage experience. But the fundamental dynamic remains. Money purchases access to beautiful spaces and the social capital that comes from association with historical significance, even when that significance involves scandal. The National Trust maintains the gardens and controls how the property is presented to day visitors, who can still tour the grounds for admission fees much higher than the original 5 shillings, but still accessible to middle-class budgets. This creates a 2-tier system where wealthy hotel guests have exclusive access to the interiors and facilities, while day visitors can walk the gardens and imagine the history. It mirrors the original system where Cliveden's power came from exclusivity, from deciding who was invited inside and who remained outside. The question is what the Profumo Affair actually changed. The scandal brought down a government, destroyed ministerial careers, and forced Cliveden's transformation from private estate to institutional property. But did it change the fundamental systems that enabled the scandal? Did it reform how elite networks operate, how power protects itself, how discretion shields dysfunction? The evidence suggests limited systemic change. British intelligence services reformed some security procedures after the Denning report, implementing stricter vetting for ministers with access to classified information. But informal networks of elite power continued operating largely as before, just more carefully. The culture of discretion remained intact, with the scandal serving as cautionary tale about getting caught rather than about the behavior itself. The class system that had allowed Stephen Ward to introduce working-class girls to aristocratic men for mutual benefit continued operating through different channels. sexual commerce between powerful men and younger women with fewer resources didn't end because of the scandal. It simply moved to less visible venues, operated with more caution about documentation, and avoided creating situations where Soviet intelligence officers could be present. The Profumo Affair's real legacy is revealing how much energy systems of privilege require to maintain themselves. The scandal showed all the machinery operating simultaneously: intelligence services protecting ministers, political parties protecting their own, media exercising discretion until discretion became impossible, the legal system targeting the vulnerable while protecting the powerful. And it showed that these systems only collapsed when the evidence became too public to contain. This is the pattern that repeats across scandals involving elite networks. The behavior is sustained through discretion and mutual protection until someone makes a mistake that exposes it. Then there is brief accountability, reforms are announced, lessons are claimed to be learned, but the underlying systems remain because they serve the interests of people with power to preserve them. The scandal becomes historical lesson rather than catalyst for transformation. Cliveden today embodies this dynamic perfectly. The estate survived by commercializing its scandal, turning disgrace into heritage marketing, and making the story of governmental collapse into luxury hotel selling point. Guests paying £800 per night are purchasing association with historical significance, and the scandal is part of that significance. The fact that the scandal exposed systematic elite dysfunction doesn't reduce its value as marketing material. If anything, it enhances it by adding danger and transgression to the story. The swimming pool, the rooms, the gardens all remain beautiful. The architecture is preserved exactly as it was, but the estate's function has been sanitized through transformation into heritage property. The scandal is acknowledged but contained, presented as historical curiosity rather than as proof that the systems enabling elite impunity remain operational. William Waldorf Astor spent £400,000 trying to buy legitimacy through architecture and art. He failed because money alone couldn't erase his origins. But the estate he built proved more resilient than his ambitions. Cliveden survived by changing what it represented, from American aspiration to British political salon to scandal site to luxury hotel. Each transformation was a response to changed circumstances, proof that institutions survive by adapting while maintaining their essential function of serving concentrated wealth and power. Nancy Astor discovered that real power came from controlling guest lists and facilitating informal conversations. She was right, and that power structure still exists. It operates differently now, through different venues and different mechanisms, but the principle remains. Proximity to power matters more than formal position, and discretion enables behavior that couldn't survive public scrutiny. The Profumo scandal proved that elite impunity has limits when exposure occurs. But it also proved that privilege can survive even spectacular disgrace by waiting for public attention to move elsewhere. Profumo was rehabilitated through decades of charity. Cliveden was rehabilitated through becoming a hotel. The systems that enabled both the man and the estate to cause damage in the first place remained largely intact, adjusted at the margins, but fundamentally unchanged. Today, new scandals emerge involving elite networks operating by unwritten rules, protecting their own until exposure forces accountability. Each scandal prompts declarations that this time will be different, and that real reform will follow. But institutions have learned from Cliveden and Profumo. They learned that survival requires better discretion, not different behavior. That privilege buys time and distance from consequence. That memory fades, and new money arrives seeking association with old glamour, no matter how dark its history. The truth revealed at Cliveden in 1963 remains true today. Power protects itself until it can't, and then it adapts and waits for the next opportunity to operate according to its original design. The house still stands, beautiful and expensive, testament not to accountability, but to resilience of the systems that survived the scandal, better than the people who were sacrificed to preserve them.